Skin of My Tooth, his memoirs by his confidential clerk, compiled and edited by the Baroness Orczy. Story 1. The Murder in the Saltashe Woods. We called him Skin of My Tooth. His friends, who were few, his clients, who were many, and I, his confidential clerk, Saltashe, and very proud I am to hold that position. I believe, as a matter of fact, that his enemies, and their name is Legion, call him Patrick Mulligan. But to us who know him, he is Skin of My Tooth. He always was, from the day that he got a verdict of not guilty out of the jury who tried James Tovey, the Dartmouth murderer. Tovey hadn't many teeth, but it was by the skin of those few molars of his that he escaped the gallows. Not thanks to the pleading of his counsel, but all thanks to the evidence collected by Patrick Mulligan, his lawyer. Of course, Skin of My Tooth is not popular amongst his colleagues. There is much prejudice and petty spite in all professions, and the law is not exempt from this general rule. Everyone knows that Skin of My Tooth is totally unacquainted with the use of kid gloves. His works for the best of his client, and let the other side look for themselves, I say. Funny-looking man, too, old Skin of My Tooth. Fat and rosy and comfortable as an Irish pig, with a face as stodgy as a boiled currant dumpling. His hair, I believe, would be red if it gave it any chance at all, but he wears it cropped so close to his bulky head that he looks bald in some lights. Then we all know that gentle smile of his and that trick of casting down his eyes which gives him a look that the best described by the word coy. That trick is always a danger signal to the other side. Now, in the case of Edward Kelly, everyone will admit that the young man came nearer being hanged for murder than any of us would care for. But this is how it all happened. On Tuesday, September 3rd, Mary Mills and John Craddock, who were walking through the Saltashe woods, came across a body of a man lying near the pond in a pool of blood. Mary, of course, screamed, and would have fled, but John, manfully conquering the feeling of sickness which threatened to overcome him too, went to the body to get a closer view of the face. To his horror, he recognized Mr. Jeremiah Wadcote, a well-known, respectable resident of Pashet. The unfortunate man seemed to John Craddock to be quite dead. Still, he thought it best to dispatch Mary at once for Dr. Howden, and also to the police station, whilst he, with really commendable courage, elected to remain beside the body alone. It appears that about half an hour after Mary had left him, John thought that he detected a slight movement in the rigid body, which he had propped up against his knee, and that the wounded man uttered a scarcely audible sigh, and then murmured a few words. The young man bent forward eagerly, striving with all his might to catch what those words might be. According to his subsequent evidence before the coroner's jury, Mr. Wadcote then opened his eyes and murmured quite distinctly, "The letter, Kelly, Edward, the other." After that, he seemed all over, for the face became more rigid and more ashen in color than before. It was past 6 o'clock before the doctor and the inspector, with 2 constables and a stretcher from Pashet's police station, appeared upon the scene and relieved John Craddock of his lonely watch. Mr. Wadcote had not spoken again, and the doctor pronounced life to be extinct. The body was quietly removed to Mr. Wadcote's house in Pashet, Mary Mills having already volunteered for the painful task of breaking the news to Miss Amelia, Mr. Wadcote's sister, who lived with him. The unfortunate man was cashier to Messrs. Kelly & Co., the great wine merchants, so Mr. Kelly of Saltashe Park, also Mr. Edward Kelly of Wood Cottage, were apprised of this sad event. At this stage the tragic affair seemed wrapped up in the most profound mystery. Mr. Jeremiah Wadcote was not known to possess a single enemy, and he certainly was not sufficiently endowed with worldly wealth to tempt a highway robber. So far, the police had found nothing on the scene of the crime which could lead to a clue. Footsteps of every shape and size leading in every direction, a few empty cartridges here and there, all of which meant nothing since Saltashe woods are full of game, and both Mr. Kelly and Mr. Edward Kelly had had shooting parties within the last few days. The public understood that permission had been obtained from Mr. Kelly to drag the pond, and not knowing what to think or to fear, it awaited the day of the inquest with eager excitement. I believe that the inquest was one of the most memorable in the annals of the coroner's court. There was a large crowd, of course, for the little town of Pashette was a mass of seething curiosity. The expert evidence of Dr. Howden, assisted in the divisional surgeon, was certainly very curious. Both learned gentlemen gave it their opinion that the deceased met his death through the discharge of a small shot fired from a rifle at a distance of not more than a couple of yards. All the shot had lodged close together in the heart, and the flesh round the wound was slightly charred. The police, on the other hand, had quite a tidbit of sensation ready for the eager public. They had dragged the pond and had found the carcass of a dog. The beast had evidently been shot with the same rifle that had ended poor Mr. Wadcote's days, and the divisional surgeon, who had examined the carcass, having pronounced the wound, which was in its side, to be exactly similar in character. A final blow dealt on the animal's head with the butt end of a rifle, however, had been the ultimate cause of its death. As a medical officer gave his sensational bit of evidence, a sudden and dead silence fell over all the crowded court, for it had leaked out earlier in the day that the dead dog found in the pond was Rags, Mr. Edward Kelly's well-known black retriever. In the midst of the silence, Miss Amelia Wadcote, the sister of the deceased gentleman, stepped forward, dressed in deep black and holding a letter, which she handed to the coroner. "It came under cover, addressed to me," she explained, "on Tuesday evening." The coroner, half in hesitation, turned the square envelope between his fingers. At last he read aloud. "To the coroner and jury at the inquest, should a fatal accident occur to me this Tuesday afternoon in Saltashe woods." Then he tore up the envelope, and immediately everyone noticed the look of boundless astonishment which spread over his face. There was a moment of breathless silence, expectation among the crowd, while Miss Amelia stood quietly with her hands demurely folded over her gingham umbrella, and her swollen eyes fixed anxiously upon the letter. At last the coroner, turning to the jury, said, "Gentlemen, this letter is addressed to you as well as to myself. I am, therefore, bound to acquaint you with its contents, but I must, of course, warn you not to allow your minds to be unduly influenced, however strange these few words may seem to you. The letter is dated from Ivy Lodge, Pashette, Tuesday, September 3rd, and signed Jeremiah Wadcote. It says, 'Mr. Coroner and gentlemen of the jury, I beg to inform you that on this day at 2:30 p.m. I am starting to walk in Saltashe, there to meet Mr. Cohet and Mr. Kelly on important business. Mr. Edward Kelly has desired me to meet him by the pond at Saltashe woods on my way. He knows of the business which takes me to Saltashe. He and I had a violent quarrel in the office on the subject last night, and he has every reason for wishing that I should never speak of it to Mr. Kelly or to Mr. Cohet. Last night he threatened to knock me down. If any serious accident happened to me, let Mr. Edward Kelly account for his actions." A deadly silence followed, and then a muttered curse from somewhere among the crowd. "This is damnable," and Mr. Edward Kelly, young, good-looking, but at this moment as pale as a death, pushed his way forward among the spectators. He wanted to speak, but the coroner waved him aside in the most official manner, while Miss Amelia Wadcote demurely concluded her evidence. Personally, she knew nothing of her brother's quarrel with Mr. Edward Kelly. She did not even know that he was going to Saltashe Woods on the fatal afternoon. Then she retired, and Mr. Edward Kelly was called. Questioned by the coroner, he admitted the quarrel spoken of by the deceased, admitting meeting him by the pond at Saltashe Woods, but emphatically denying having the slightest ill feeling against old Wadcote, as he called him, and above all, having the faintest desire of wishing to silence him forever. "The whole thing is a ghastly mistake, a weird joke," he declared firmly. "But the quarrel," persisted the coroner. "I won't deny it," reported the young man. "It was a result of a preposterous accusation old Wadcote saw fit to level against me." "But why should you meet him clandestinely in the woods?" "It was not a clandestine meeting. I knew that he intended walking past Saltashe from Pashat to the woods. The road from my house cuts in the direction which he would be bound to follow, exactly at right angles. I wished to speak to him, and it saved me a journey all the way to Pashat, or him one down to my house. I met him at 3:30. We had about 15 minutes' talk, and then I left him and went back to my home." "What was he doing when you left him?" asked the coroner, with distinct sarcasm. "He had sat down on a tree stump and was smoking his pipe." "You had your gun with you, of course, on this expedition through the woods?" "I seldom go out without my gun this time of year." "Quite so," assented the coroner grimly. "But what about your dog, who was found with its head battered in, very close to the spot where lay the body of the deceased?" "Poor old Rags strayed away that morning. I did not see him all that day. He certainly was not with me when I went to meet old Wadcote." The rapidly spoken questions and answers had been listened to by the jury and the public with breathless interest. No one uttered a sound, but all were watching the handsome young man who seemed, with every word he uttered, to incriminate himself more and more. The quarrel, the assassination, the gun which was carrying, he denied nothing, but he did protest his innocence with all his might. One or two people had heard the report of a gun whilst walking on one or another of the roads that skirt Saltashe Woods, but their evidence as to the precise hour was unfortunately rather vague. Reports of guns in Saltashe Woods were very frequent, and no one had taken particular notice. On the other hand, the only witness who had seen Mr. Edward Kelly entering the wood was not ready to swear whether he had his dog with him or not. Although it had been fully expected, ever since Jeremiah Wadcote's posthumous epistle had been read, the verdict of willful murder against Edward St. John Kelly found the whole population of Pashat positively aghast. The brother of Mr. Kelly, of Saltashe Park, the accused was one of the most popular figures in this part of Hertfordshire. When his subsequent arrest became generally known in London, as well as in his own county, horror, amazement, and incredulity were quite universal. Part 2. The day after that memorable inquest and sensational arrest, namely on the Saturday, I arrived at her old dingy office in Finsbury Square about 12 o'clock, after I had seen some business in Somerset's house for my esteemed employer. I found Skin of My Teeth curled up in his armchair before a small fire, as the day was wet and cold, just like a great fat and frowsy dog. He waited until I had given him a full report of what I had been doing, and then he said to me, "I've just had a visit from Mr. Kelly of Saltashe Park." I was not astonished. That case of murder in the Saltashe Woods was just one of those which inevitably drifted into the hands of Skin of My Tooth. Though the whole aspect of it was remarkably clear, instinctively one scented a mystery somewhere. I suppose, sir, that it was Mr. Edward Kelly's behalf. Your penetration, Muggins, my boy, surpasses human understanding. My name is Alexander Stanislans Mullins, but Skinny Tooth will have his little jokes. You are willing to undertake the case, sir? I'm going to get Edward Kelly out of the hole his own stupidity has placed him in. It will be by the skin of his teeth if you do, sir. The evidence against him is positively crushing, I muttered. Miss is as good as a mile, where the hangman's rope is concerned, Muggins. But you had better call on Handsome. We can go to the pasture this afternoon. Edward Kelly is out on bail, and Mr. Kelly tells me that I shall find him at the wood cottage. I must get out of him the history of his quarrel with the murdered man. Mr. Kelly did not know it? Well, anyway, he seemed to think the best. The accused should tell me his own version of it. In any case, Mr. Kelly and his wife are devoured with anxiety about his brother, who seems to have been a bit of a scapegrace all his life. There was no time to say more, then, that we found out by hurrying. The 1:50 p.m. train to Pashet. We found Mr. Edward Kelly at Wood Cottage, a pretty little house in the outskirts of Saltashe woods. He had been told by a likely visit by his brother. He certainly looked terribly ill, and like a man overweighted by fate and circumstances. I'm a victim of most damnable circumstances, Mr. Mulligan, he said. But I swear, I am incapable of such a horrible deed. I always take for granted, Mr. Kelly, said Skin of my Teeth blandly, that my client is innocent. If the reverse is the case, I prefer not to know it. But you might have to appear before magistrate on Monday. I must get a certain amount of evidence on your behalf in order to obtain what I remain to want. So will you try to tell me, as concisely and clearly as possible, what passed between you and Mr. Woodcote the day before the murder? I understand that there was a quarrel. Woodcote saw fit to accuse me of certain defalcations in the firm's banking account, which I was totally innocent, began Mr. Edward Kelly quietly. As you know, my brother and I are agents from England for M. de Courte's champagne. Woodcote was our cashier and bookkeeper. Twice a year we pay over to M. de Courte's bank in Paris the money derived from our sales of his wine, after deducting our commission. And meanwhile, we have, jointly, the full control of the money. That is to say, all checks paid to the firm have to be endorsed by both of us, and all checks drawn on the firm must bear both our signatures. It was just a month before a half-year settlement of accounts. Woodcote, it appears, went down to the bank and got the passbook and cancelled checks, and discovered that some £10,000 over the credit line due next month to M. de Courtet had been drawn out of the bank, the amounts having been debited from the books. To my intense amazement, he showed me the checks, and then and there accused me of having forged my brother's name and appropriated the firm's money to my own use. You see, he knew of certain unavowed advantages of mine which had often landed me in financial difficulties more or less serious, which are the real cause of my being forced to live in Wood Cottage, whilst my brother can keep up a fine establishment in Saltashe Park. The accusation was preposterous, and I was furious with him. I looked at the checks. My signature certainly was perfectly imitated, but my brother's perhaps a little less so. They were bearer checks made out to the replica of old Woodcote's handwriting to E. de Courtet, and endorsed on the back in a small, pointed foreign hand. Old Woodcote persisted in his accusations, and very high words ensued between us. I believe I had threatened to knock him down if he did not shut up. Anyway, he told me that he would go over to the next afternoon to Saltashe Park to expose me before my brother and to M. de Courtet, who was staying there on a visit to England for the shooting. I left him then, meaning to go myself to the same evening to Saltashe Park to see my brother about it. But on my journey home, certain curious suspicions with regard to old Woodcote himself crept up into my mind, and then and there I determined to try to see him again and talk the matter over more dispassionately with him, and what I thought would be his own interests. My intention was to make, of course, my brother acquainted with the whole matter at once, but to leave M. de Cohitz out of the question at the present. So I wired to Wardcote in the morning to make an assignation, which was proved a most terrible mistake. Edward Kelly added that he left Jeremiah Wardcote after his interview with him at the pond, and in an excited frame of mind as before. Fearing that his own handwriting on the checks might entail serious consequences to himself, nothing would do but M. de Cohitz as well as Mr. Kelly must be told the whole thing immediately. When I left him, concluded the young man, he was sitting on a tree stump by the pond, smoking his pipe, and I walked away to Wood Cottage. Do you know what became of the chicks? Asked Skin of my Tooth. Wardcote had them in his pocket when I left him. I conclude there has been no mention of them by the police, that they have not been found. There was so much simplicity and straightforwardness in Edward Kelly's narrative that I, for one, was ready to believe every word of it. But Skin of my Tooth's face was inscrutable. He sat in a low chair with his hands folded before him, his eyes shut, and a general air of polite imbecility about the whole unwieldy person. I could see that our client was viewing him with a certain amount of irritability. "Well, Mr. Mulligan," he said at last, with nervous impatience. "Well, sir," replied Skin of my Tooth, "it strikes me that with your quarrel with the deceased, the signation of Woods, the posthumous denunciation of you as his assassin, and his dying words, we have about as complete case as we could wish." "Sir?" "In all cases of this sort, my dear sir," continued Skin of my Tooth quietly, "the great thing is to keep absolutely cool. If you are innocent, remember, I do not doubt it for a moment, then I will bring that crime home to its perpetrator. Justice never miscarries, at least when I have the guidance of it in my hands." It would be impossible to render the tone of supreme conceit with which Skin of my Tooth made his last assertion, but it had the desired effect, for Edward Kelly brightened up visibly as he said, "I have implicit faith in you, Mr. Mulligan. When shall we see you again?" "On Monday, before the magistrates. I can get that remand for you, I think, and then we shall know freehand. Now, we had better get along. I want to have a quiet think of the affair." Part 3. On Monday, Edward Kelly was formally charged before the Beak, and I must say that when I heard the formidable array of circumstantial evidence which the police had collected against our client, I sadly began to fear that not even by the skin of his teeth would Edward Kelly escape the awful hole in which he was literally wallowing. However, Skin of my Tooth hammered away at the police evidence with regard to the dog. The prosecution made a great point of the fact that Master Wardcote and Rags had been killed with the same rifle and at the same time and place, and at one point Edward Kelly's favor was that neither his servants at Wood Cottage nor the witness who saw him enter the wood could swear to the dog was with him on the day. On the strength of that, and for the purpose of collecting further evidence with regard to the dog, Skin of my Tooth finally succeeded in obtaining a remand until the following Friday. Personally, I thought that there was quite sufficient evidence for hanging any man without the testimony of a dead dog, but I am quite aware that my opinion counts for very little. "Now, Muggins," said Skin of my Tooth to me later in the day, "the fun is about to begin. You go down to Coutts this afternoon and find out all about those checks which caused the quarrel, and by whom they were presented. Don't mix the police up in the affairs, whatever you do. If there is anything you can't manage, get Fairburn to help you. He has discretion itself and hates the regular force. Beyond that, try and work alone." I had done more difficult jobs than that before, and now Skin of my Tooth knows he can rely on me. I left him curled up in an armchair with a French novel in his hand and started on my quest. I got to Coutts just before closing time, saw the chief cashier and explained my errand and its importance to him, asking for his kind of help in the matter. He was courteous in the extreme, and within a few moments I had ascertained from him the checks on Kelly & Co.'s account, perfect in regale, and made out to E. de Counter, or bearer, had been cashed on certain dates which he gave me. They were in each instance presented by a commissionaire in uniform, who brought the card M. Edouard de Courtier, with "Please give bearer amount in £5 notes," scribbled in pencil in the same handwriting as the endorsement on the checks. The amounts varied from £1,200 to £3,000, continued the cashier, still referring to his book. Being bearer checks and signed in the usual manner, we had no occasion to doubt them, and of course we cashed them. The first check was drawn July 3rd, and the last was drawn August 29th. The cashier added one more detail which fairly staggered me, namely that the commissioner wore a cap with Kelly & Co. embroidered on it. If necessary, there were plenty of cashiers and clerks in the bank who could identify him. He was a tall man of marked foreign appearance, with heavy black hair, a beard, a mustache cut very trim. On one occasion when he left, he dropped a bit of paper containing Van Voort's Turf Commission agent, Flushing, Holland. I thanked the cashier, and I took my leave. When I got back to the office, I found Skin on my Tooth placidly sleeping in his big armchair. I had had a hard day, and was dead tired, for the moment when I saw him there, looking so fat, so pink, and so comfortable. Well, I have a great respect for him, but I really felt quite angry. However, I told him what I had done. Capital, Muggins!" he ejaculated angrily. "But by Jove, that's a clever rascal. That touch about the name on the cap is particularly happy and daring. It completely allayed the suspicions of the cashier's accounts. Now listen, Muggins," he added, with that sudden, quick-changing mood in which, in him, a moment transformed him from the lazy, apathetic Irish lawyer to the weird human bloodhound who scents the track. "That foreign commissionaire is a disguise, of course. The chap hides the edge of the wig and shades the brow. The black beard and mustache conceal the mouth and chin. The foreign accent disguises the voice. You may take it, therefore, that the thief and his ambassador are one and the same person. A man, moreover, well known in Court, since the disguise was necessary. Do you follow me, Muggins? And remember that the motive is here. The man who defrauded Kelly & Co. is the same man who murdered Wardcoat later on. Wardcoat was effectually silenced, and the telltale checks were evidently been destroyed. There would have been silence and mystery over the whole scandal until the defalcations could be made good, but for Wardcoat's letter to the coroner and his dying words. The letter. Kelly. Edward. The other? He paused suddenly, and remembered, seemed lost in thought. Then he muttered, "It's that confounded dog I can't really make out. Did Edward Kelly, after all? It was the great after all which had me puzzled all along. Was Edward Kelly guilty after all? I'd asked myself hundreds of times a day. Then I was silent, lost in conjectures of this extraordinary and seemingly impenetrable mystery. He suddenly jumped up and shouted, "By Jove, I've got it, Muggins! The other! What a fool I've been! Go to bed, my boy. I want to rest too. Tomorrow we will be time enough to think about the other." Part 4. From that moment, Skin on my Tooth was a transformed being. He always is when he has got the case well in hand, as he calls it. He certainly possesses a weird faculty for following up the trail of blood. Once he holds what he believes to be a clue, his whole appearance changes. His great fat body seems, as it were, to crouch together, ready for a spring, and there's a weird quiver about his nostrils which probably suggests a bloodhound. Only his eyes remain inscrutable, hidden beneath their thick and fleshy lids. It was 12 o'clock when the next day our train steamed to Pashette Station. We had to fly from there to drove down to Saltashe Park, the lordly country seats of Mr. Kelly. At the door, Skin of my Tooth asked for the master of the house, but hearing that he was out, he suggested that his card might be taken to Mrs. Kelly. The next moment we were ushered into a luxuriously furnished library, full of books and flowers, and with deep mullioned windows opening out upon a Queen Anne terrace. The mistress of the house, an exceedingly beautiful woman, received us with every mark of eagerness and cordiality. She welcomed us, or rather my esteemed employer, most effusively, and when we were all seated, she asked many questions of Mr. Edward Kelly, to which Skin of My Tooth replied as often as she allowed him to get a word in.
"Oh, Mr. Mulligan," she said finally, "I'm so glad that you asked to see me. I've been positively ill and devoured with anxiety over my brother-in-law. My husband thinks that I am upset myself and only get hopelessly wretched if I read about it all in the papers, so he won't allow me to see one for now. But I assure you, uncertainty is killing me, as I feel assured that Mr. Kelly is trying to comfort me and to make Edward's case appear more hopeful than it is."
Skin of My Tooth gravely shook his head. "I could not very well be more hopeless," he said.
"You can't mean that," she said, while gathering her tears in her eyes. "He is innocent, Mr. Mulligan. I swear he is innocent. You don't know him. He would never do anything so vile."
"I quite believe that, my dear lady, but unfortunately circumstances are terribly against him. Even his dead dog Rags speaks in dumb eloquence in his master's condemnation."
"Rags!" she exclaimed in astonishment. "What can that poor doggie have to do with this awful tragedy? Poor old thing! It lost its way the very morning the terrible catastrophe occurred. M. de Cohort was staying here that day, and I had taken him for a drive to the hitching before luncheon. On my way home I saw Rags on the road, looking very sorry for himself. I took him in the carriage with me and brought him home."
Skin of My Tooth looked politely interested, but I hardly liked to breathe. It seemed to me that the fellow's creator's life was even now hanging in the balance.
"Rags knew all of us here just as well as he knew his own master,"
continued Miss Kelly.
"When my husband went out with his gun in the afternoon, Rags followed him, whilst M. de Cohort and I went to the garden party."
"And what happened to Rags after that?" asked Skin of My Tooth.
"To tell you the truth, the awful tragedy I heard of that afternoon drove poor Rags out of my mind. And the next day, I'm thankful to say, M. de Cohort left us and went back to Paris. I did hear something about the poor dog being drowned in the pond. That was a shocking rover. It really must trouble and pleasure to his master."
Miss Kelly was sitting with her back to the great mullioned windows. She could not, therefore, see her husband, who seemed to have just walked across the terrace to have a pause for a moment, with his hand on the open window before entering the room. Whether he had heard that his wife was saying, I do not know. Certain it is that his face looked very white and set.
"I remember now," continued Miss Kelly innocently, "seeing my husband put away Rags' collar the other day in the Sparrow. I dare say Edward will be glad to have it later on, when all this horrid business is over. You must tell him that we've got it back quite safe."
I all but uttered an exclamation then. It seemed too terrible to hear this young wife so hopelessly and innocently denouncing her own husband with every word she uttered. I looked up at the motionless figure still standing in the window. Skin of My Tooth, who sat immediately facing it, seemed to make an almost imperceptible sign of warning. Mr. Kelly then retired as silently as come. 2 minutes later, he entered the room by the door. He seemed absolutely calm and collected, and held his hand out to Skin of My Tooth, who took it without the slightest hesitation. Then Mr. Kelly turned to his wife and said quietly, "Will you forgive me, won't you, dear, if I take Mr. Mulligan into my study? There are 1 or 2 points I want to discuss with him over a cigar."
"Oh, I'll run away," she said gaily. "I must dress for luncheon. You'll stay, won't you, Mr. Mulligan? No, I am sorry. Well, goodbye, and mind you bring better news next time."
She was gone, and we 3 men were left alone. I offered to leave the room, but Mr. Kelly motioned for me to stay. "The servants would wonder," he said icily, "and it really does not matter. Then he turned to Skin on my Tooth and said quietly, I suppose that you came here today for the express purpose of setting a trap for my wife, and she fell into it, poor soul, not knowing that she was damning her own husband. Of course, you did your duty by your client. Now, what is your next move? To place Miss Kelly in a witness box on my client's behalf and make her repeat the story she told us today, replied Skin of my Tooth with equal calm. And after that? After that, you must look to yourself, Mr. Kelly. I am not a detective, and you know best whether you have anything to fear once the attention of the police is directed upon yourself. I shall obtain Mr. Edward Kelly's discharge tomorrow, of course, backed by Miss Kelly's testimony, and, if need be, that of Mr. Cohet in Paris. I can now prove that the dog could not have been shot by my client, since it was following you that afternoon the murder was committed. Since the chief pointed in the theory of the prosecution lies in the fact that Mr. Wadcote and the dog were shot the same day, with the same rifle, and seeing the animal's collar was known to be in your possession the day following the crime, my client is absolutely assured to obtain a full discharge, and to be allowed to leave the court without a stain upon his character. Mr. Kelly listened to Skin of my Tooth's quiet explanation without betraying the slightest emotion. And then he said, Thank you, Mr. Mulligan. I think I quite understood this situation. Personally, I feel that it is entirely for the best. Life under certain conditions becomes abominable torture, and I have no strength left in which to combat fate. I did kill old Wadcote in a moment of unreasoning fear, just as I killed Rags, because he too made too much noise. But, by heaven, I had no intention to kill the old man, and I certainly never would have allowed my brother to suffer seriously under an unjust accusation. I firmly believe that justice could not miscarry, and while I thought that you were sharp enough to save him, I also reckoned that I had been clever enough to shield myself from every side. He paused a moment, and then he continued, just like a man for whom the long time has been burdened with his secret, and suddenly made almost happy by confiding it to a stranger. I had had many losses on the turf, he said, and had made the losses good by defrauding our firm. It was a long and laborious plan, very carefully laid, but I was always clever with my pen, and my brother's signature and Wadcote's writing were easy enough to imitate. Then one day I found an old uniform in the cellar of the office. My father used to keep a commissionaire when he had a business. It was about my size and gave me the idea for a disguise. It all worked right, and I knew that I could make my defalcations good at the bank very soon. It was a positive thunderbolt to use when, on Tuesday morning, I received a letter from old Wadcote telling me that he was coming over to Saltashe that afternoon to see M. de Cohet and myself about a terrible discovery he had made. I knew that he would walk through the woods, and I found him sitting near the pond, smoking alone. I only meant to persuade him to hold his tongue and say nothing to M. de Cohet for the present. But he was obstinate. He guessed that I was guilty. He threatened me with disclosure, like the fool he was, and I had to kill him, in self-defense. Somehow, although he undoubtedly was a great criminal, I could not help sympathizing with this man. This beautiful house we were all in, all the luxury and comfort which he was outwardly surrounded, seemed such terrible mockery inside the moral tortures he must have endured. I was quite glad when he had finished speaking, and the Skin of my Tooth was able presently to take his leave. Only a few hours later, the evening papers were full of the sensational suicide of Mr. Kelly in his apartment in Saltashe Park. Almost at the same time as this astonishing news was published by the press, the authorities of Scotland Yard had received a written confession, signed by Mr. Kelly, in which he confessed to having caused the death of Mr. Jeremiah Wadcote in Saltashe Woods by the accidental discharge of a gun. Little frightened at first of any complications that might arise, he had said nothing about the accident at the time. Then, when his own brother became implicated in the tragedy, and how he felt terrible at his own position, would now be if he made a tardy confession. The matter began to prey upon his mind until he became so unhinged when sought in death solace for his mental agony. That man was a genius, said Skin of My Teeth, commenting on the confession. Strange that he should have lost his nerve at the last, for I feel that the crime would never have been brought absolutely home to him. At any rate, I could always have gotten him off. What do you think, Muggins? And I quite agreed with Skin of My Tooth.